If I told you that the average person retiring today is going to be short by over $1 million, not because they didn't save, not because they didn't work hard, but because of one decision they made in their 20s that felt completely harmless at the time, would you believe me? Most people think the retirement mistake is not saving enough. It's not. The real mistake is almost invisible. It doesn't show up on a bank statement. Nobody warns you about it. And by the time you feel its effects, it's already too late to fully undo. Stay with me on this one, because by the end of this video, you're going to look at your own retirement account completely differently. Let's start with the number everyone gets wrong. Financial advisors love to say, just start saving as early as possible. True, but vague. What they don't explain is the actual cost of waiting. Let's do the real math. Imagine two people. Person A starts investing $300 a month at age 25. Person B waits 10 years and starts investing the exact same $300 a month at age 35, trying to catch up later. Both invest until age 65. Both assume a 7% average annual return, which is roughly what the stock market has delivered after inflation over the last century. Person A, who started at 25, ends up with roughly $720,000 by retirement. Person B, who started at 35, ends up with around $340,000. Same monthly contribution, same rate of return, same number of working years left when they retire. The only difference is 10 years, and that 10-year gap didn't cost person B half the money, it cost them more than half. That's the part nobody explains properly. Compound growth isn't linear, it's exponential, which means the earliest dollars you invest do dramatically more work than the dollars you invest later, even if the later dollars are larger. This is the first mistake, and it's the one everyone already sort of knows about, waiting too long to start. But it's not actually the $1 million mistake I'm talking about. It's just the warm-up. The real mistake is something almost every single person does, even people who start investing early, even people who are disciplined, even people who think they're doing everything right. Here it is. Most people dramatically underestimate how much they'll actually need, because they calculate retirement based on today's cost of living, instead of what things will cost by the time they retire. Let's say you're 30 years old right now, and you look at your expenses and think, I spend about $50,000 a year to live comfortably, so if I retire with $1 million, I'll be fine. That math feels solid. It is not solid. It's dangerously wrong, and here's why. Inflation doesn't pause for your retirement plan. At an average historical inflation rate of around 3% a year, prices roughly double every 24 years. So that $50,000 a year lifestyle you're budgeting for today will cost approximately $100,000 a year by the time you're 55, and closer to $150,000 a year by the time you're 65 if you work another 3 decades. Most people build their entire retirement number using today's dollars and never adjust for this. They see $1 million as some magical finish line because it sounds like a lot of money, without realizing that $1 million in 30 years will have the real-world purchasing power of roughly $400,000 today. It will not buy the lifestyle they imagined. It will barely stretch to cover a modest one. This is the mistake, not failing to save, not failing to invest, calculating your entire future using present-day prices, and then being blindsided decades later when the number that once sounded huge turns out to be nowhere near enough. And here's where it gets worse, because there's a second layer to this same mistake that almost nobody accounts for either. Healthcare costs in retirement rise faster than general inflation, often by a significant margin, because medical spending tends to increase as people age at exactly the same time medical costs themselves are climbing. So the very years when you need the most money are also the years when your money is losing purchasing power the fastest, on the exact category of spending you can't avoid. Let's put a real face on this. Someone spends their 20s and 30s investing responsibly, hits their 40s feeling proud they've crossed $300,000 in retirement savings, and assumes they're roughly a third of the way to a comfortable $1 million retirement. What they don't realize is that the $1 million target they're measuring against was calculated using today's cost of living, not the cost of living 20 or 30 years from now when they actually retire. By the time they get there, that same $1 million buys a fraction of what they originally planned for, and they're forced to either keep working years longer than expected, drastically cut their lifestyle, or run out of money in their 70s or 80s, exactly when they're least equipped to go back to work. This is happening to millions of people right now, quietly, and it has nothing to do with laziness or bad decisions. It's a math mistake baked into how retirement planning gets talked about. Financial media loves round numbers. $1 million sounds like an achievement, a headline, a milestone. Nobody makes a viral video titled, "You actually need 1.8 million adjusted for inflation depending on your retirement age," because it's not catchy. But it's the truth, and the gap between the catchy number and the real number is exactly where people fall short. So what's the fix? It's simpler than you'd think, but it requires changing how you think about the target itself. Instead of picking a fixed dollar amount as your retirement goal, calculate your goal as a multiple of your future expenses, adjusted for inflation, not your current expenses. A widely used rule among financial planners is that you need approximately 25 times your annual expenses saved, using expenses calculated in the dollars you'll actually be spending at retirement age, not today's dollars. That 25 times number comes from the idea that withdrawing around 4% of your portfolio per year, adjusted for inflation, has historically allowed a retirement fund to last approximately 30 years without running out, based on long-term market return data. So if you're 30 years old, currently spending $50,000 a year, and you expect to retire in 35 years, you don't need 25 times $50,000. You need 25 times whatever $50,000 will actually cost in 35 years after inflation, which, at 3% average inflation, is closer to $140,000 a year. 25 times that is $3.5 million, not $1 million. That's the real target hiding behind the comfortable, round, misleading number everyone anchors on. I know that number probably just made your stomach drop a little. Good. That reaction is exactly why this mistake is so dangerous, because the moment people hear the real number, it feels impossible. So they mentally reject it and go back to the comfortable fictional number instead. But here's the part that should actually make you feel better instead of worse. The earlier you correct this mistake, the smaller the actual monthly adjustment needs to be, because you're letting compound growth do most of the heavy lifting instead of you. Someone who realizes this at 25 might only need to increase their monthly contribution by a relatively modest amount to close that multi-million-dollar gap, because they still have 4 decades of compounding ahead of them. Someone who doesn't realize this until they're 55 is in a genuinely difficult position, because there isn't enough time left for compounding to do the work, which means the entire gap has to be closed through drastically higher contributions or a delayed retirement age. This is exactly why the mistake is called a $1 million mistake. The cost of ignoring this for even a decade isn't measured in thousands of dollars. It's measured in hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, depending on how long the blind spot lasts. There's also a psychological reason this mistake spreads so easily, and it's worth understanding because it explains why smart, financially responsible people still fall into it. Humans are naturally bad at reasoning about exponential change. Our brains are wired for linear thinking. If inflation is 3% a year, it feels like it should just slowly, gently erode value over time, the same amount every year. But 3% compounding for 3 decades doesn't behave gently at all. It behaves explosively, the same way compound interest working in your favor behaves explosively. The tragedy is that most people apply exponential thinking correctly when they're excited about investment growth, and completely forget to apply the same exponential thinking to the cost side of the equation. They remember that their money will grow. They forget that their expenses will grow just as fast, sometimes faster. Let's talk about who this mistake hits hardest, because it's not evenly distributed. It disproportionately affects people who started saving responsibly early, hit a comfortable-sounding number, and then eased off their contributions because they felt like they were ahead of schedule. Ironically, being disciplined enough to hit an early milestone can be exactly what causes someone to relax too soon, because the milestone itself was calculated using the wrong math from the very beginning. It also hits people who rely entirely on employer retirement matching, without ever independently recalculating their real target, assuming that if their employer says they're on track, they must actually be on track, without realizing that most retirement projection tools default to conservative, round, marketable numbers, rather than inflation-adjusted, personalized targets based on your actual expected lifestyle and expected retirement age. So what should you actually do with all of this? First, stop anchoring on round numbers like $1 million, as if they mean anything on their own, because $1 million means something completely different depending on whether you're retiring in 5 years or 35 years. The number only becomes meaningful once it's translated into future purchasing power. Second, recalculate your target using your expected expenses at your actual retirement age, not your expenses today. Even a rough estimate using a standard inflation assumption will get you dramatically closer to reality than ignoring inflation completely. Third, revisit this number periodically, not just once. Inflation rates shift, your expected lifestyle shifts, healthcare assumptions shift, and a target calculated once in your 20s should not be treated as fixed and permanent for the next 4 decades. And fourth, understand that the earlier you correct course, the cheaper the correction is. This isn't a scare tactic, it's simply how compounding works in both directions. The cost of fixing this mistake at 30 is a fraction of the cost of fixing it at 50, and the cost of fixing it at 50 is a fraction of the cost of trying to fix it at 60 with almost no working years left to recover. Here's the honest, slightly uncomfortable truth this video is built around. Nobody is lying to you on purpose when they tell you to aim for $1 million in retirement savings. It's not a scam, it's not a conspiracy, it's just outdated, oversimplified advice that made more sense decades ago, when inflation assumptions and retirement timelines looked different. The mistake survives because it sounds achievable, it sounds motivating, and correcting it requires admitting the real number is bigger and scarier than the one you've been comfortable with. But avoiding an uncomfortable number doesn't make it smaller. It just means you find out how big it really is later in life, when you have far fewer tools left to do anything about it. The people who end up actually comfortable in retirement aren't the ones who got lucky or found some secret investment. They're the ones who did this uncomfortable recalculation early, adjusted their savings rate while they still had decades of compounding on their side, and stopped measuring their progress against a number that was never actually accurate in the first place. So before you close this video, do the uncomfortable math. Take your current annual expenses, estimate how many years until you retire, apply a reasonable inflation assumption, and multiply that adjusted expense number by 25. That's your real target, not the round number you've been quietly comfortable with, the real one. If this changed how you think about your own retirement number, that's exactly the kind of math nobody sits you down and explains, which is exactly why these videos exist. Subscribe if you want the real numbers behind every financial milestone everyone assumes, but nobody actually calculates. And tell me in the comments what your real inflation-adjusted retirement number came out to be. I guarantee it's higher than you expected, and I want to know by how much.